A single father took his son to the park, but when the boy ran towards a stranger shouting, "Mommy," secrets came to light, and their lives changed forever. A story that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment on where you are watching from. The January sun beat down hard on the asphalt of Central Park, creating small waves of heat that danced over the lush vegetation. It was one of those typical summer mornings in New York City, when the city still breathed with a certain tranquility before the chaotic traffic took over the streets. David Johnson adjusted his Ray-Ban sunglasses and checked his Tag Heuer watch again. 9:15 a.m. on a Saturday, he had carefully planned to be perfect. At 42, David was the kind of man who impressed at first sight. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with perfectly styled grey hair, he wore a navy blue Ralph Lauren polo shirt and immaculate white Adidas sneakers. His upright posture and penetrating gaze revealed years of leadership in his consulting firm, one of the most respected on Wall Street. Every movement was calculated, every word weighed before being spoken. He was a man used to having control over all variables in his life. "Dad, can I go play on those swings?" The high-pitched voice of Ethan broke his thoughts. The 5-year-old bounced beside him, his brown eyes shining with excitement as he pointed to the colorful playground in the distance. "Sure, buddy, but stay where I can see you, okay?" David knelt to be at the boy's height, adjusting the little New York Yankees shirt he insisted on wearing that morning. Ethan had dark, curly hair, a tan complexion, and a smile that melted any heart. He was a vibrant child, full of energy, but with a sensitivity that sometimes caught David off guard. The businessman chose a strategic bench under a cherry blossom tree, from where he could observe all the activity in the playground. He took his smartphone out of his pocket and began responding to some emails that couldn't wait until Monday. It was a habit his ex-fiancée always criticized. "David, you can't even unplug when you're relaxing." Maybe she was right, but work was his comfort zone, the place where everything made sense and where he was sure he could control the outcomes. The park was busy for a Saturday morning. Entire families occupied the picnic areas, children ran among the century-old trees, and the distant sound of music from speakers mingled with the joyful screams of the little ones. David observed everything with an analytical eye, mentally categorizing the people around him. The relaxed parents letting their kids run free, the overprotective mothers following every step of their children, the patient grandparents pushing strollers. "Dad, look how high I'm going on the swing," Ethan shouted from a distance, waving enthusiastically as he swung higher and higher. David gave a thumbs up in approval, but a pang of anxiety hit his chest. What if the boy fell? What if he got hurt? He controlled the impulse to run over and ask Ethan to play more carefully. In the last 3 years since adopting Ethan, David had transformed. The man who used to work until 10 every night now left the office at 6 to have dinner with his son. His bachelor apartment on the Upper East Side had been traded for a spacious house in Brooklyn, complete with a backyard, private playground, and a Superman-themed bedroom. His entire life had been reorganized around that child who had come like a hurricane, to fill a void he didn't even know existed. The adoption process had been long and bureaucratic, filled with psychological interviews, social worker visits, and mountains of paperwork. David clearly remembered the day he met Ethan at St. Mary's Orphanage in East Harlem. The boy was only 2 years old at the time, sitting alone in a corner of the indoor playground, hugging a worn teddy bear. When their eyes met, something inexplicable happened, as if 2 pieces of a puzzle finally fit together. "Why do you want to adopt a child?" the psychologist had asked during one of the assessment sessions. David remembered hesitating before answering. "Because I feel like I have so much love to give, but I've never found the right person to start a traditional family." It wasn't a lie, but it also wasn't the whole truth. The complete truth included sleepless nights, thinking about mortality, the legacy he would leave, the growing feeling that all his professional success meant nothing if he didn't have someone special to share it with. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cherry blossom tree above his head, and David closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to relax. The characteristic smell of the park, a mix of damp earth, flowers, and that indefinable aroma of a big city, calmed him. It was in those moments that he felt closest to being the father that Ethan deserved, present, attentive, loving. "Ethan, come here for a second," he called when he saw the boy had stopped playing and was watching something on the other side of the playground. But Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he started running in the opposite direction, his colorful sneakers hitting the ground in a rapid rhythm that made David's heart race. "Ethan, come back here!" David stood up abruptly, knocking his phone off the bench. The boy was running faster and faster, dodging other children and parents, as if he were being magnetically drawn to something specific. David ran after him, his breath becoming labored, not only from the physical effort, but from the anxiety that took over his chest. On the other side of a small clearing near one of the park's lakes, a woman was sitting alone on a bench, throwing breadcrumbs to a group of ducks. Ethan stopped abruptly 2 meters away from her, as if he had finally arrived at the destination he was searching for. David, still running, witnessed the exact moment when everything changed. Ethan looked at the woman. She raised her eyes and smiled gently, and then, "Mommy!" The word echoed through the park like thunder on a clear day. Ethan's shout carried pure, genuine, desperate joy, the kind of recognition that comes from somewhere deep and inexplicable. The woman froze, a crumb of bread still suspended in her hand, her eyes wide with surprise and confusion. David stopped running, feeling as if the world had stopped spinning around him. The silence that followed. Ethan's shout seemed to stretch on for an eternity. David stood paralyzed, watching the scene unfold before him as if he were a spectator in his own life. The woman remained motionless, still holding the piece of bread, while the pigeons continued pecking around her feet, oblivious to the human drama unfolding. "Hi, sweetie," the woman finally said, her soft voice carrying a Midwestern accent. She slowly crouched down to Ethan's level, and David could see her face better. She looked to be in her mid-30s, with light brown skin, deep brown eyes, and a smile that radiated natural kindness. There were small expression lines around her eyes, the kind that only appear on people who genuinely smile often. "You mistook me for someone else, didn't you?" Ethan stepped closer, his little eyes studying every detail of the woman's face, as if he were trying to decipher an important mystery. "You smell like Mommy," he said simply, with that brutal honesty that only children possess. David finally managed to move, quickly approaching his son. "Ethan, buddy, come back here." "I'm sorry, ma'am. His voice faltered as she stood up, and he could see her fully. She was shorter than she had appeared, sitting with soft curves and a presence that instantly conveyed calm. She wore an impeccably white nursing uniform and comfortable sneakers, carrying a simple brown leather bag that showed signs of wear. "It's no problem," she replied, offering an understanding smile that hit David like a punch in the stomach. "Kids sometimes make those associations. I work with many of them at the hospital." She extended her hand to David. "My name is Sarah Johnson." "David Johnson," he replied automatically, shaking her hand. Her skin was soft, but her hands had small calluses that indicated constant work. "And this is my son Ethan. I apologize again. He usually doesn't do this with strangers." Sarah knelt down again, getting to Ethan's level. "Hi, Ethan. What a beautiful name. Do you know how old you are?" Her voice had a hypnotic quality, the kind of tone that calmed crying children in hospital emergencies. Ethan extended a small hand, showing 5 fingers. "5! And my daddy is the best in the whole world." He looked at David with adoration before turning his attention back to Sarah. "But you look a lot like my mommy." David felt the blood freeze in his veins. In the 3 years since the adoption, Ethan had never mentioned his mother this way. Throughout the adaptation process, whenever asked about his biological parents, the boy simply said that Mommy was traveling very far. Exactly the explanation David had carefully rehearsed to protect the child's feelings until he was older to understand the complex truth about abandonment and adoption. "Oh, really?" Sarah asked gently, showing no discomfort with the situation. "And what is your mommy like?" Ethan closed his eyes in concentration, as if trying to access very distant memories. "She sang pretty songs when I was scared of the dark, and she smelled good, just like you." He opened his eyes and looked directly at her. "Can you sing for me?" David was about to intervene when Sarah surprisingly began to hum a lullaby that he vaguely recognized, something about little stars and golden dreams. Her voice was sweet and melodic, and Ethan closed his eyes again, a peaceful smile spreading across his face. "Ethan loves music," David heard himself saying, trying to fill the strange silence that had settled. "He always asks me to sing before bed, but I'm terrible. I don't know where he gets that taste from." "All kids love music," Sarah replied, standing up again. "It's something universal, don't you think? Like it's a language we all understand, no matter where we come from." She paused, observing Ethan, who still kept his eyes closed, seemingly memorizing the melody. "I work at the Children's Hospital in the pediatrics department. I see many kids every day, and music always calms them." David nodded, trying to process the strangeness of the situation. "We live nearby. Ethan loves coming to the park on Saturday mornings. It's our tradition." Why was he sharing personal information with a complete stranger? But there was something about Sarah that made him feel compelled to honesty. "It's nice to have traditions like that," she replied sincerely. "I also come here on my days off. It's the only place in Springfield where I can listen to the birds sing." She looked around the park, taking a deep breath. "I grew up in a small town, in Springfield. The city sometimes suffocates me, but here—" She made a sweeping gesture with her hands. Ethan abruptly opened his eyes and held Sarah's hand. "Can you come play with me at the playground, please?" David felt a wave of panic. "Ethan, Miss Sarah must be busy." "Actually," Sarah looked at David as if asking for permission, said, "I have the morning free. If you don't mind, I would love to play a little. It's been a while since I've been on a slide." And that's how David found himself sitting on a bench at the playground, watching a nurse he had just met push her son on the swing while they chatted animatedly about everything from cartoons to favorite ice cream flavors. Sarah had a contagious laugh, and Ethan was more relaxed and happy than David had seen him in months. "She's nice, right, Dad?" Ethan shouted from the swing, waving enthusiastically. "Yes, son," David replied, but his mind was racing. How could he explain that instant connection? Why had Ethan reacted that way? And why was he feeling a strange familiarity, as if Sarah was someone he should know? When they finally said goodbye, it was almost noon. Sarah needed to go home to prepare for her afternoon shift, and David had promised Ethan lunch at the mall. "It was a pleasure meeting you," Sarah said, shaking David's hand again. This time, he noticed a subtle jasmine perfume she wore, floral but not overpowering, natural like her personality. "The pleasure was ours," David replied, realizing he was being completely sincere. Ethan ran to Sarah and hugged her tightly, hiding his face in her waist. "Will you be here next Saturday?" Sarah looked at David questioningly before answering. "Well, I usually come here on my days off. Maybe we'll run into each other again." On the way home, Ethan wouldn't stop talking about Sarah. "Dad, She's just like the mommy in my dreams. She sang the song I already knew. How is that possible?" David drove in silence, his son's words echoing in his head like a persistent echo. For the first time in 3 years, he began to question whether he really knew everything he needed to know about Ethan's past. And why had that jasmine scent triggered a memory he couldn't place? That night, after Ethan fell asleep, David stayed up late, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what had happened at the park. One thing he knew for sure: his carefully controlled life had just encountered a variable he didn't know how to calculate. The following week passed like a haze for David. In the mirrored hallways of his office in Midtown Manhattan, during meetings with important clients, even at home preparing dinner for Ethan, his mind constantly returned to that morning in the park. The jasmine scent seemed to have seeped into his memory, surfacing at random moments and bringing with it a restlessness he couldn't name. "Dad, when are we going to see Sarah again?" Ethan asked for the 10th time that week while playing with his toy cars in the living room. The house in Upper East Side, which David had carefully decorated to be the perfect environment for raising a child, suddenly felt too big, too quiet. "I don't know, son. She works a lot at the hospital," David replied, trying to keep his voice casual while pretending to read a financial report. In reality, he had spent more time than he would like to admit researching General Hospital online, trying to find information about Sarah Johnson without coming off as a stalker. Ethan abandoned the cars and climbed onto the sofa next to his dad. "Dad, why did my mommy go away so far?" The question hit David like a bullet. It was the first time Ethan had shown real curiosity about his biological mother since he came into his life. For 3 years, whenever the subject came up, the boy simply accepted the explanation about the trip and changed the subject. But something had changed after meeting Sarah. David closed his laptop and pulled Ethan closer, feeling the weight of responsibility for his future words. "Remember we talked about how some mummies can't take care of their babies, and then other special people like Dad take care of them?" "I remember," Ethan nodded, his brown eyes fixed on his father's face. "But why, and couldn't she take care of me? Was I a very difficult baby?" David's heart broke a little. "No, my love. You've always been perfect. Sometimes mommies go through very complicated situations that have nothing to do with the babies. And do you know what's most important?" He kissed his son's forehead. "It's that now you're here with me, and I love you more than anything in the world." Ethan was silent for a few moments, processing the information. "I wonder if she's okay, the mommy who traveled." "I'm sure she is," David gently lied, because the truth was, he knew absolutely nothing about Ethan's biological mother. The orphanage documents were scarce, just that a teenager had voluntarily given up the baby and requested not to be contacted. No name, no address, no story. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, David found himself doing something he never imagined, driving to General Hospital. He didn't have a specific plan, just an inexplicable need to understand better the woman who had caused such a reaction in his son. The hospital at night was a different universe. Harsh fluorescent lights illuminated corridors that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. David walked through the hallways, aimlessly observing nurses and doctors rushing by, anxious families waiting in plastic chairs, the nightly ballet of an institution that never slept. "Can I help you?" A feminine voice startled him. David turned and saw an older nurse, with grey hair and a kind but tired expression. I'm looking for a nurse. Sarah Johnson. She works in pediatrics," David said, feeling ridiculous for being there. "Sarah?" The woman's face lit up. "She left about an hour ago, but she'll be back tomorrow morning for the 6 o'clock shift. You are family?" "No, we met at the park. My son was very impressed with her," David explained, feeling increasingly embarrassed. The nurse smiled knowingly. "That's very common. Sarah has a special gift with children. She has worked here for almost 10 years, and I've never seen a child who didn't calm down with her." She paused, studying David. "She also volunteers on weekends at St. Mary's Orphanage. A saint, that girl." David felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "St. Mary's Orphanage?" "Yes. Do you know it? She practically grew up there, helping to care for the younger children when she was still a teenager. After she graduated in nursing, she never stopped volunteering there." David's world began to spin. St. Mary's Orphanage was exactly where he had adopted Ethan 3 years earlier. The chances of it being a coincidence were astronomically small. "Sorry, I need to go," David murmured, hurriedly leaving the hospital before the nurse could ask more questions. During the drive home, his mind was racing. Sarah had worked at the same orphanage where Ethan had spent his first 2 years of life. This would explain the child's instant reaction. She had probably cared for him as a baby. But why hadn't she recognized Ethan immediately at the park? At home, David went straight to his office and searched the locked drawer where he kept all the adoption documents. He spread the papers across the table, looking for any mention of specific nurses or caregivers. Most of the documents were bureaucratic, legal forms, psychological reports, health statements. But at the bottom of the file he found something he had forgotten: a small photo album that the director of the orphanage had given him on the day he took Ethan home. With trembling hands, David opened the album. The first photos showed Ethan as a few-month-old baby, sleeping in a simple crib, playing with colorful toys, being fed by feminine hands that appeared partially at the edges of the images. David examined each photo with a magnifying glass, searching for clues he had previously overlooked. On the last page of the album, he found a larger photo showing Ethan, about a year old, being carried by a young nurse in a white uniform. The photo was slightly out of focus, and the woman's face was not fully visible, but David could see dark hair tied in a bun and a familiar posture. His heart raced. Could it be Sarah? The photo had been taken 3 years earlier. She would be younger, perhaps with different hair, but the body structure seemed similar. And if it was her, why hadn't she recognized Ethan at the park? David remembered the nurse's words at the hospital. Sarah had worked there for almost 10 years and had been volunteering at the orphanage since her teenage years. During that time, she had probably cared for hundreds, maybe thousands of children. Would it be reasonable to expect her to remember one specifically? But Ethan had remembered her even after 3 years. The next morning, David made a decision that surprised him. He called his assistant and cancelled all his meetings for the day. Instead, he drove to St. Mary's Orphanage, determined to uncover the truth. The building was exactly as he remembered. A well-preserved old structure painted light yellow with large windows that let in plenty of natural light. The yard where he had first met Ethan was filled with children playing, their joyful shouts echoing between the walls. "Mr. Johnson!" The director, Sister Benedicta, greeted him with a warm smile. "What a wonderful surprise! How is our Ethan?" "He's great, Sister. Growing fast. And happy," David replied, trying to keep his voice casual. "Actually, I came here for a specific reason. I need to know about a volunteer nurse, Sarah Johnson. Does she still work here?" Sister Benedicta's smile faded slightly. "Sarah, yes, she still comes on weekends. But may I ask why?" David hesitated before telling her about the encounter at the park. As he spoke, he noticed Sister Benedicta's expression becoming increasingly thoughtful. "I understand," she finally said. "Mr. Johnson, may I be frank with you? Please." Sarah was one of the primary caregivers for Ethan during the time he was here. She had a special affection for him. Sometimes she would stay beyond her hours just to calm him when he cried or was sick. The sister paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. When you adopted Ethan, she was very emotional. It was hard for her to say goodbye. David felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Why didn't anyone tell me this at the time? Because it wasn't relevant to the legal adoption process, and because Sarah specifically asked not to be mentioned. She said it would be easier that way, the sister sighed. Mr. Johnson, Sarah has never been able to have children of her own. She channels all her maternal love into the children here. Ethan was special to her. Now everything made sense. Ethan's reaction, the familiarity David had felt, the song she knew. Sarah hadn't recognized Ethan immediately at the park because he had changed so much in 3 years, but the connection between them remained intact. Is she coming here today? David asked. Yes, she is. She usually arrives around noon for the children's lunch. David looked at the clock. It was 11:30. Sister, can I wait? David remained seated in the small waiting room of the orphanage for 40 minutes that felt like an eternity. He watched through the window as the children played in the yard, some chasing after a worn-out soccer ball, others swinging on an old wooden swing that creaked with every movement. The place smelled of home-cooked food and detergent, a mix that immediately transported him back to the day he met Ethan. Sister Benedicta appeared from time to time, offering coffee or water, but David could barely process her words. His mind was racing. Sarah was focused on a single question: how to approach her. When she arrived, how to explain that he had discovered the connection between her and Ethan without seeming invasive or disturbed. At 12:15 p.m., he heard the familiar sound of a motorcycle stopping outside. Through the window, he saw Sarah taking off her helmet, revealing slightly tousled dark hair from the wind. She wore faded jeans and a simple, light blue t-shirt, very different from the professional uniform she wore at the hospital. There was something more relaxed about her posture, more youthful, as if the orphanage was the place where she could be completely herself. Sarah has arrived, sister, Mary announced unnecessarily, appearing at the door of the waiting room. I will call her in, but Mr. Johnson, please be gentle. Sarah is very sensitive when it comes to the children who have been here. David nodded, his stomach tightening with nerves. Moments later, Sarah appeared at the door, clearly confused about being called to the visiting room instead of going directly to the kitchen where she usually helped serve lunch. David. Her voice showed genuine surprise. What are you doing here? He stood up, noticing that she looked even more beautiful in the natural light coming through the window. Without the uniform and the formal atmosphere of the hospital, Sarah radiated a warmer, more approachable energy. Can I talk to you? It's about Ethan. The change in her expression was instantaneous. Surprise gave way to a caution that was almost painful, as if she were bracing herself for bad news. Is he okay? Did something happen? He's great. David hurried to reassure her, watching her shoulders visibly relax. Actually, it's about what happened at the park last Saturday. I discovered that you worked here when he was a baby. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage. When she opened them again, David saw a vulnerability she had carefully hidden during their first meeting. Yes, she said simply, I remember him very well. They fell silent for a few seconds, the weight of that revelation hanging between them. David could hear the distant sound of children playing outside, their laughter creating an ironic soundtrack to the tension that had settled in the room. Why didn't you say anything at the park? David finally asked. Sarah sighed and sat down in one of the simple chairs, gesturing for him to do the same. Because Ethan has grown so much. When I saw him at the park, for a moment I thought he looked familiar, but I wasn't sure. And even if I had... She paused, carefully choosing her words. What would be the point? He has a new life, a good family. I didn't want to confuse him or create problems. But he recognized you immediately, David insisted. He called you Mommy. That can't just be a coincidence. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back with determination. Ethan spent 2 years here. I worked 3 nights a week and every weekend. When he was a baby, I was the one who woke up with him in the middle of the night, who fed him, who sang him to sleep. Her voice grew softer, more distant, as if she were reliving those memories. He had frequent nightmares, cries that none of us could explain. I was the only one who could calm him. David felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Gratitude that Ethan had someone who cared so much for him, but also an irrational jealousy that it hadn't been him offering that comfort in the boy's early years. Sister Mary told me it was hard for you when he was adopted, David said gently. Sarah laughed, but it was a sound without humor. Hard is a small word to describe it. I knew it was best for him. You clearly could offer a life that I could never provide. A home, financial stability, quality education. She paused, looking down at her hands, but that didn't make saying goodbye any easier. Sarah, can I ask you a personal question? She nodded, discreetly wiping her eyes. Why have you never had children of your own? I mean, you're clearly wonderful with kids. You have a stable job. The question clearly hit a sensitive spot. Sarah was silent for a long moment before responding. When I was 22, I found out I have severe endometriosis. The doctors said my chances of getting pregnant naturally are almost nil. She paused, taking a deep breath. I tried treatment for a few years, but it was expensive, painful, and in the end, it didn't work. So I decided that my mission was to care for the children who are already in the world and need love. David felt his heart tighten. I'm sorry. You don't need to be, she replied with a firmness that surprised him. I found my calling here. These children give me more joy than I could ever give them. And Ethan, was he special to you? Sarah hesitated before answering, clearly debating internally how much to reveal. Ethan came here when he was just 2 weeks old. He was very small, very fragile. The doctors weren't sure if he would survive his first weeks. She paused, a tear finally escaping. I spent many nights awake with him, praying that each breath wouldn't be his last. When he finally started to gain weight, to smile, to laugh, it was like a personal miracle. David remained silent, processing the information. Ethan had never shown health problems. On the contrary, he was a vibrant and energetic child. Knowing that he had started life so precariously moved him deeply. That's why he remembers you, David finally said. You literally saved his life. We saved him, Sarah corrected him. The whole team here, the doctors who cared for him, and then you, who gave him a real family. I was just a small part of the story. David leaned forward, suddenly struck by an idea that surprised him with its clarity. Sarah, Ethan, asks about you all the time. Days since Saturday. He was clearly connected to you in a way that went beyond the ordinary. And frankly, seeing him happy like that, it was the first time in a long while that I saw him so radiant. What are you suggesting? I don't know exactly, David admitted, but maybe we could, I don't know, meet occasionally, so that Ethan can maintain that connection. Of course, if you want to. I don't want to force anything. Sarah studied him for a long moment, and David could see an internal conflict unfolding on her face. Hope versus fear, desire versus caution. David, she finally said, I need to be honest with you. I don't know if I could get close to Ethan again and then have to pull away. Last time, it almost destroyed me. If we're going to do this, it would need to be with the understanding that it would be a long-term commitment, not just a few sporadic meetings. The seriousness in her voice made David realize the magnitude of what he was proposing. He wasn't just suggesting casual meetings. He was potentially inviting someone to become a permanent presence in Ethan's life, and by extension in his own life. "I understand," he said, "and I wouldn't make this suggestion lightly. Ethan is the most important person in the world to me. If I'm willing to share time with him, it's because I believe it would be beneficial for him." Sarah nodded slowly. "Can I think about it? It's a big decision for me, too." "Of course. Take all the time you need." David pulled a card from his pocket. "My number is here. Call when you decide." As they said goodbye in the courtyard of St. Mary's Orphanage, David watched Sarah head to the kitchen to help with the children's lunch. Several of them ran towards her shouting, "Aunt Sarah!" And he could see the instant transformation on her face, caution giving way to pure, contagious joy. Driving back home, David wondered what exactly he had just proposed. His carefully controlled life was about to get complicated in ways he couldn't foresee. But when he thought of Ethan's smile in the park, he knew he had made the right decision. The next 3 days passed in an exasperating slowness for David. Every phone buzz made him jump, compulsively, checking if Sarah had decided to call. In the office, his secretary Marcia commented at least twice that he seemed distracted lately. And during an important meeting with a banking client, David found himself staring out the window instead of paying attention to the performance graphs that usually fascinated him. Ethan, on the other hand, had made Sarah the central topic of all conversations. During breakfast on Wednesday morning, while eating his colorful cereal at the large, well-lit kitchen table in their Brooklyn home, he asked for the 10th time, "Dad, do you think Sarah likes chocolate ice cream? And Superman movies? We could invite her to watch with me." David smiled, absently stirring the coffee that had long since gone cold. "I don't know, buddy. When we talk to her again, you can ask." "When will that be?" Ethan insisted, swinging his little legs in the high chair. At 5 years old, he still needed a cushion to reach the table comfortably, and David always felt a rush of emotion at these little reminders that Ethan was still so small, so dependent on him. "Soon," David replied vaguely, hoping he was right. The answer came on Thursday afternoon. Right. In the middle of a tense call with a client who was threatening to cancel a $1 million contract. David's personal phone rang insistently until he was forced to ask for a few minutes' break. "David, it's Sarah." Her voice sounded hesitant over the line. "Sarah, hi." David hurried out of his office, ignoring Marcia's curious glance. "How are you?" "Well, I've thought a lot about our conversation, about Ethan." She paused, and David could hear hospital noises in the background, distant voices, the occasional beep of monitors, the sound of hurried footsteps. "I accept your proposal. I mean, if the offer is still on the table." David felt a wave of relief so intense that he had to lean against the hallway wall. "Of course! That's great! Ethan will be over the moon." "But I have a few conditions," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a professional firmness that David recognized from his experience dealing with delicate situations at the hospital. "First, I need you to understand that this isn't about me wanting to be his mother. You are his father, and I completely respect that. Second, if at any point you feel that my presence is confusing Ethan or causing problems, I will step back without question. Sarah. And third," she interrupted him, "I need to get to know you better too. Ethan is clearly well cared for and happy, but if I'm going to get involved in his life again, I need to make sure you're the man you seem to be." David was surprised by her frankness, but also impressed. Sarah was protecting Ethan just as he would. "I completely understand. In fact, I admire that you're being so careful." "So, what do you suggest?" David thought quickly. "How about Saturday again? We can meet at the park. Let Ethan play and we can talk. No pressure." "Sounds good," Sarah agreed. "Same time as last Saturday." "Perfect. Oh, and Sarah, thank you for being willing to try this." There was a pause before she responded. Thank you for understanding that Ethan needs all the people who love him in his life." When David hung up, he realized he was smiling in a way he hadn't in a long time. He returned to the meeting with a renewed energy that even surprised the dissatisfied client. That night, during dinner, chicken lasagna that David had learned to make by watching videos on YouTube because Ethan declared it was his favorite food in the world, he broke the news. "Ethan, remember Sarah we met at the park?" Ethan dropped his fork immediately, his eyes widening. "I remember. Mommy Sarah." "Well," David said carefully, "I talked to her today, and she would like to meet us at the park again on Saturday, to play with you if you want." Ethan's joyful shout echoed throughout the house. He jumped out of his chair and ran to David, climbing into his lap and hugging him tightly. "Really, Dad? Really? Is she going to sing to me again? Can I tell her about my new dinosaur?" David laughed, hugging his son and feeling his heart swell with a happiness he hadn't experienced in a long time. "You can tell her everything you want, my love." That night, after Ethan finally fell asleep, a process that took an extra hour due to his excitement about Saturday, David found himself seriously thinking about what was happening in his life. In the 3 years since the adoption, he had become completely focused on being the best father possible for Ethan. Work, relationships, hobbies, everything had become secondary to the task of raising that child. Not that he regretted that choice. Ethan had transformed his life in ways he never thought possible. Before fatherhood, David lived a predictable routine of work and superficial social commitments. Now his weekends were filled with trips to the zoo, cartoon sessions, and not always successful attempts to cook dishes that a 5-year-old would consider delicious. But there were moments of loneliness, especially late at night, when Ethan was asleep and the house fell silent. Moments when David wondered if he was being selfish by raising Ethan alone, if the child would be happier with 2 parents, or at least with a present maternal figure. Sarah's entry into their lives opened up possibilities that David didn't dare to fully name. He wasn't thinking about romance, at least not consciously, but there was something about the way she looked at Ethan, the naturalness with which she interacted with him, that made David imagine what it would be like to have someone to share the responsibilities and joys of parenthood. Friday passed even more slowly than the rest of the week. Ethan woke up talking about Sarah and went to bed making elaborate plans to show her all the coolest toys at the playground. David, trying to keep expectations realistic, gently reminded him that it would just be a casual meeting, but internally he was as anxious as his son. Saturday dawned with a cloudy sky and a cool breeze that threatened rain. David dressed Ethan with extra care, a new Spider-Man t-shirt and his favorite sneakers that lit up when he ran. He chose a well-tailored casual shirt for himself and left off the sunglasses, wanting Sarah to see him clearly. They arrived at the park 15 minutes early, and Ethan immediately ran to the exact spot where they had met Sarah the previous week, as if he expected her to materialize on the same bench. David followed him more slowly, observing the morning activity in the park, families having picnics, couples walking, children running between the trees. When Sarah arrived exactly on time, David felt a strange pang in his stomach. She wore a simple navy blue dress and white sneakers, her hair flowing gently in the wind. She carried a small, colorful bag that seemed to contain toys or books. "Sarah!" Ethan shouted, running toward her like a little guided missile. This time, David didn't run after him. He just watched as Sarah knelt down to receive the enthusiastic hug, her face lighting up with a smile that could have melted any heart. "Hi, my dear," she said, hugging Ethan tightly. "Wow, how you've grown in a week." Ethan laughed as if it were the funniest joke in the world. "I didn't grow, Sarah. You're the funny one." David approached, noticing how the interaction between the two seemed completely natural, without any of the hesitation or formality that usually marked first meetings. It was as if they were just continuing a conversation that had been briefly interrupted. "Hello, David," Sarah said, standing up and offering that warm smile he had thought about all week. "Hi," he replied, feeling unexpectedly shy. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for inviting me," she replied. Then, turning to Ethan, "So, how about showing me those amazing toys you told me about?" And thus began a morning that would change everything for the three of them. The next 2 hours passed like minutes. David watched in fascination as Sarah and Ethan explored every corner of the playground with the energy of two old friends reuniting after a long separation. She not only played with him, but did so with a total dedication that was impressive, going down the slide without worrying about her dress, pushing the swing at the exact pace Ethan requested, and even agreeing to participate in an elaborate game of make-believe, where she was a princess and he a brave knight saving her from invisible dragons. "Dad, come be the dragon!" Ethan shouted from the top of the slide, waving enthusiastically at David, who remained seated on the bench observing the scene. "I think I'd better not," David replied, gesturing to his phone. "I'm checking some emails." Sarah paused in the middle of the play and walked over to him. "David, are you sure everything's okay? You seem a little distant." She was right. David had spent the morning observing instead of participating, analyzing each interaction as if it were a scientific experiment that needed careful monitoring. It was an old habit, his tendency to control situations by staying one step back, watching and evaluating before fully committing. "Sorry," he said, putting away his phone. It's strange for me. Sharing time with Ethan like this. Usually, it's just the two of us." Sarah sat down next to him, on the bench, and David noticed again that subtle jasmine scent that had lingered in his memory. "I understand. It must be scary to let someone else into your circle after 3 years of building this routine." The understanding in her voice surprised him. "It is. Exactly that. Not that I don't trust you," he hurried to clarify. "It's just that you're used to being in control." Sarah finished the sentence with a small smile. "Ethan told me that you make the best pancakes in the world and that you always check 3 times if he brushed his teeth before bed." David laughed, feeling slightly exposed. "He told you that?" "Among other things. He also said that you read to him every night and that you know all the names of the dinosaurs because you studied specifically to answer his questions." Sarah paused, watching Ethan, who was now trying to convince a group of other kids to join his epic battle against dragons. "David, you are clearly a wonderful father. Ethan is a secure, confident, and happy child. That doesn't happen by chance." The unexpected validation hit David in a vulnerable place he rarely allowed to be touched. "Thank you. Sometimes I worry if I'm doing everything right. I never had a very good example of fatherhood when I was a child." "What do you mean?" David hesitated. It was rare for him to share personal details, especially about his family. But there was something about Sarah, perhaps the way she listened with complete attention, or the evident sincerity in her eyes, that made him want to be honest. "My father was very focused on work, physically present, but emotionally distant. My mother tried to compensate, but she had her own issues, anxiety, depression that was never properly treated." David looked at Ethan, who was now teaching other kids to roar like dragons. "I grew up thinking that love was something you showed through achievements and material success. It took years of therapy to understand that a child needs real emotional presence." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That's why you are so present with Ethan. You're giving him what you wish you had received." "Exactly, but sometimes I wonder if I'm being too overprotective. If Ethan shouldn't have, I don't know, more people in his life, a mother figure, grandparents, a larger family." "And what do you think about that now?" Sarah asked gently. David looked at her, noticing how the sunlight filtering through the cherry blossom trees created patterns of light and shadow on her face. "I think maybe Ethan would benefit from having more people who care about him. People like you." The moment was interrupted by Ethan running towards them, breathless and sweaty from playing. "Sarah! Sarah! Did you see how I defeated the giant dragon? I was super brave." "I did." Sarah opened her arms, and Ethan jumped into her lap without hesitation. "You were the bravest knight I've ever seen." David watched the scene. Sarah hugging Ethan, the boy smiling and relaxed in her arms, the genuine affection on her face, and felt something stir in his chest. It wasn't exactly jealousy, but a complex emotion that mixed gratitude, relief, and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. "You know," he said impulsively, "how about we have lunch together? I know a place nearby that has an outdoor playground. Ethan loves it." Sarah seemed surprised by the spontaneous suggestion. "Are you sure? I don't want to intrude more than I already have." "Please," David interrupted her, "I would like that. And Ethan would be over the moon." "Yeah!" Ethan shouted before Sarah could respond. "Sarah, you have to try the burger there. It's the best in the whole world." Sarah laughed. "Well, if it's the best in the whole world, how can I refuse?" The restaurant was just a 5-minute walk from the park, a cozy, familiar place that David had discovered shortly after the adoption when he was desperately looking for kid-friendly spots to take Ethan. The atmosphere was casual, with wooden tables, hanging plants, and a small playground in the back where kids could play while their parents ate. Peacefully, they chose a table near the playground, and David watched Sarah study the menu with the same focus she applied to all her actions. There was something comforting about her presence, a natural calm that seemed to perfectly balance Ethan's vibrant energy. "So," David said after they placed their orders, "tell me more about you, about your life outside the hospital and the orphanage." Sarah smiled, fiddling absent-mindedly with her napkin. "There's not much to tell, honestly. Work, volunteering, a few close friends. I enjoy reading, especially historical novels. I know, it's cliché. On weekends, when I'm not at the orphanage, I usually visit my grandmother in Springfield." "Did your grandmother raise you?" "Partially. My parents died in a car accident when I was 12. I went to live with my maternal grandmother, but she was already elderly and had health issues. At 15, I came to São Paulo to study and lived in a support house for teenagers." Sarah paused, watching Ethan play in the restaurant's playground. "That's where I met St. Mary's Orphanage. I started volunteering there as a teenager, and I've never stopped." David felt a wave of admiration for this woman who had faced so many losses yet dedicated her life to caring for others. That must have been very difficult. It was. But it also taught me that family isn't just about blood or biology. It's about the people who choose to stay in your life, who care about you regardless of the circumstances. She looked directly at David. "Just like you did with Ethan. Just like you are doing by allowing me to be part of his life again." The lunch unfolded in an increasingly relaxed atmosphere. Ethan alternated between eating his favorite nuggets and running to the playground, always returning, to tell David and Sarah about some new adventure he had experienced on the slides. Sarah showed infinite patience with the repetitive stories and the boy's boundless energy, engaging in each narrative as if it were the first time she had heard it. "Sarah," Ethan said seriously during one of his eating pauses, "can you be my weekend mommy?" The silence that followed was heavy. David felt his stomach tighten as he watched Sarah's expression shift from surprise to something that looked like pain. "Ethan," David began carefully, "remember we talked about how Sarah is a very special friend, but—" "I know," Ethan interrupted, looking between the two adults with that seriousness that sometimes appeared in small children. "You're my daddy forever, but can Sarah be my heart mommy, like Joam's grandma at school is his heart grandma?" Sarah discreetly wiped away a tear that was beginning to form. "Ethan, I would love to be your special friend, your heart aunt. How about that?" Ethan considered this for a moment before vigorously shaking his head. "That works. Heart Aunt Sarah." He smiled brightly, as if he had solved a complex problem. "Now can you come to my house and watch a movie with me?" David looked at Sarah, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. They were clearly navigating unknown territory, making decisions that could affect Ethan's life and their own in ways they couldn't foresee. "How about we start slow?" David suggested. "Maybe Sarah can come over for dinner one day this week if she wants." Sarah nodded slowly. "I would love that." "Wednesday!" Ethan exclaimed. "On Wednesdays, Daddy always makes spaghetti and meatballs. It's the second best in the world, after Joan's Heart Grandma's lasagna." David laughed. "Wednesday it is then, if that's okay with you, Sarah." "That sounds perfect," she replied, and David noticed her voice trembled slightly with emotion. When they finally said goodbye in the restaurant parking lot, Ethan hugged Sarah with a strength that surprised everyone. "Heart Aunt Sarah," he murmured against her neck. "I missed you so much." Sarah closed her eyes, hugging him back. "I missed you too, my dear, more than you can imagine." David watched the farewell with a mix of emotions that he knew would take days to fully process. One thing, however, was crystal clear. Their lives had just become complicated in an irreversible way. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't scare him as much as it should have. Tuesday passed in a cloud of anxious preparations. David left work early to go to the supermarket, where he spent 40 minutes selecting ingredients for Wednesday's dinner, as if he were planning a state banquet. San Marzano tomatoes for the sauce, freshly grated Parmesan cheese, organic basil that cost 3 times as much as the regular kind. Ethan accompanied him through the supermarket, making increasingly elaborate suggestions. "Daddy, does Sarah like chocolate? Can we buy ice cream and flowers for the table?" Bruno's mom always puts flowers on the table when they have guests. "Calm down, buddy," David laughed, pushing the cart down the pasta aisle. "It's just a casual dinner." But the truth was that David was just as nervous as Ethan was excited. There was something about having Sarah in his home, his personal space, the sanctuary he had carefully created for Ethan, that made everything feel more real, more significant. For 3 years, very few people had been invited for family dinners. A few co-workers during holiday parties, the occasional babysitter when he needed to travel for work, but never someone Ethan considered part of his emotional life. Wednesday dawned with David waking up at 5 in the morning, 2 hours before the alarm. He spent the extra time tidying up the house with a meticulousness that would make any home decor magazine proud. The living room, usually organized but lived in, with Ethan's toys scattered in corners and drawings stuck to the fridge, was carefully arranged without losing its homey personality. David wanted Sarah to see that this was a home where a child was loved, but also that he was capable of maintaining a tidy and welcoming environment. Noticing his father's anxiety, Ethan decided to help by arranging all his favorite toys in the living room to show Sarah. The result was an impressive display of cars, dinosaurs, and coloring books that occupied practically the entire coffee table. "Ethan," David said patiently, "how about we leave just a few toys in the living room? The rest can stay in your room for you to play with after dinner." "But Daddy, Sarah needs to meet Rex," Ethan protested, clutching a green plastic dinosaur affectionately. "And Batman's car, and my collection of special stones." David knelt beside his son, understanding that Ethan's anxiety was as real as his own. "How about we choose 3 very special things to show Sarah during dinner, and then, if she wants, you can show her the rest in your room." This negotiation took another 20 minutes, but ultimately resulted in the careful selection of one dinosaur. Rex, of course, a coloring book that Ethan had colored especially for Sarah during the week, and a small plant he had grown at school and was caring for on the kitchen windowsill. At 6 in the evening, David was finishing up the sauce when the doorbell rang. Ethan shouted, "She's here!" and ran to the door before David could stop him. "Calm down, buddy. Let's open it together," David said, wiping his hands on the apron he had forgotten he was wearing, a colorful apron with fruit designs that Ethan had picked out for him on Father's Day. When they opened the door, Sarah was standing in the hallway holding a small bouquet of sunflowers and a brown paper bag. She wore a simple light blue blouse and jeans, but there was something different about her. Perhaps it was her hair down over her shoulders or the soft lipstick that accentuated her natural smile. "Hi," Ethan shouted, jumping to hug her before she could even step into the apartment. "Hi, sweetheart," Sarah replied. David smiled, balancing the flowers as he returned the hug. "Wow, what a beautiful house, and what a wonderful smell." David felt ridiculously proud of these simple comments. "Come in, please. Sorry for the mess. I mean, it's not messy, but—" "David," Sarah interrupted him with an understanding smile. "Relax. Everything is perfect." She handed the flowers to Ethan, who received them as if they were the most valuable gift in the world. "They're for the table, to make it pretty during dinner," she explained. "And this," she lifted the bag, "is a surprise for after the meal." "What is it? What is it?" Ethan bounced with curiosity. "You'll have to wait to find out," Sarah said with a mysterious smile that made Ethan dramatically groan in anticipation. The tour of the house was a revealing experience for David. Seeing his home through Sarah's eyes, he noticed details that usually went unnoticed. The photos of Ethan scattered throughout the rooms, from baby to now. The fridge covered in drawings and reminders of school activities. The living room shelf filled with children's books, organized by size and color. The special corner in Ethan's room where all his favorite teddy bears were kept. "You really turned this place into a perfect home for a child," Sarah observed, as Ethan proudly showed off his superhero-themed room. "I tried," David admitted. "When I adopted Ethan, I was living in a bachelor apartment in the Upper East Side. 2 bedrooms, minimalist decor, all black and white. I quickly realized it wasn't a place to raise a child." Sarah stopped in front of the wall where David had created a photo timeline showing Ethan growing up, from the early days after the adoption to recent pictures in the park. "What a lovely idea. Ethan, did you see how much you've grown?" Ethan studied the photos seriously. "I was really small when I came to live with Dad. But look." He pointed to a recent photo where he was smiling and holding a school certificate. "Now I'm big and I can read difficult words." "I'm so proud of you," Sarah said, and David noticed that her words carried a deep emotion that went beyond what would be appropriate for a recent acquaintance. Dinner flowed with a naturalness that surprised David. Sarah genuinely praised his cooking. "This sauce is amazing. You'll have to teach me the recipe." Enthusiastically participated in Ethan's stories about school and his friends, and showed genuine interest in the family's hobbies and routines. "Sarah," Ethan said seriously, while twirling pasta around his fork with the concentration of a surgeon, "can you come have dinner with us every week?" Sarah looked at David before responding. "How about we see how it goes? Maybe we can meet regularly, but we don't want to wear your dad out cooking for us every week." "I wouldn't mind," David heard himself saying, surprising himself with the sincerity of the statement. After dinner, Sarah revealed her surprise, a finger-painting kit with non-toxic paints and special paper. "I thought we could make art together. What do you think?" What followed was one of the most joyful experiences David had had in a long time. The 3 of them sat on the living room floor on old newspapers, And Sarah taught Ethan, and reluctantly David, the technique of painting with their hands to create interesting textures and shapes. Ethan was ecstatic to discover he could use his palms to make suns, his fingers to create trees, and even his feet to make colorful footprints on the paper. "Dad, look!" Ethan shouted, showing his hands covered in blue and yellow paint. "I made a magical forest." David, who had started the activity worried about the potential mess, found himself completely engrossed in creating a purple mountain using only his clenched fists. Sarah, with paint splatters on her face and clothes, laughed at the intense concentration with which both the men in her life approached the artistic project. "You're a natural artist," she told David, admiring his carefully detailed mountain. "I learned from the best teacher," David replied, looking at Ethan, who was now creating colorful footprints on a second sheet of paper, softly humming a tune he recognized as one of the lullabies Sarah had sung in the park. When they finally cleaned up the mess and hung the artworks to dry, it was already past 9 o'clock, well beyond Ethan's usual bedtime. But the child was so energized by the special evening that he seemed wide awake. "How about Sarah tells me a story before bed?" Ethan suggested hopefully. David was about to say that Sarah had already stayed long enough and probably wanted to go home, but she anticipated him. "I'd love to. What kind of story do you like? Stories about brave knights, or about good dragons, or about—" Ethan paused, thinking. "About special families that meet in magical ways." Sarah and David exchanged glances, both touched by the child's unconscious wisdom. "I think I know exactly the right story," Sarah said. And that's how David found himself sitting on the edge of Ethan's bed, listening to Sarah tell an improvised story about a little prince who lived in a castle with his king father, and how one day they met a kind fairy who had cared for the prince when he was a baby, but whom he had forgotten. The story was about how, when they reunited, the prince immediately recognized the fairy in his heart, and how the three formed a special family based on love and not just blood. Ethan fell asleep before the end of the story, a peaceful smile on his face. Sarah finished the narrative in whispers, gently kissed the child's forehead, and followed David out of the room in complete silence. In the living room, surrounded by the still-drying paintings and the lingering aroma of dinner, they sat on the sofa with a careful distance between them. "Thank you for the wonderful evening," Sarah said softly. "It's been a long time since I've had such a lovely time. I feel like part of a family like this." "Thank you," David replied. "Ethan was beaming all night, and I had more fun than I expected." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, both processing the emotional intensity of what had happened. "David," Sarah finally said, "can I be honest about something?" He nodded, his heart racing slightly. "Tonight made me realize how much I've missed this. Having a family, caring for someone, being cared for. I don't want you to think I'm trying to take anyone's place, but—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Ethan brings out maternal feelings in me that I thought I could never have. And you—" She looked directly at him. "You are a very special man, David. Ethan is lucky to have you as his father." David felt something stir in his chest. Gratitude, attraction, fear, hope, all mixed into a complex emotion he didn't know how to name. "Sarah," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended, "you're special too, very special, and Ethan clearly loves you in a unique way." They looked at each other for a moment that seemed to stretch indefinitely, both aware that they were on the brink of something that would change everything irreversibly. It was Sarah who broke the moment, getting up from the sofa. "I think I better go. It's late, and I have an early shift tomorrow." David walked her to the door, watching her grab her bag and check that she hadn't forgotten anything. "Sarah," he said as she was about to leave, I'd like to do this again. Dinner, regularly. She smiled, that smile that had become so familiar in such a short time. I would love that too. After the door closed, David stood in the hallway for several minutes, trying to process what had happened in his orderly life. His home still smelled of Sarah's jasmine perfume, and he knew that scent would now be a permanent part of his memories of that night. For the first time in 3 years, David fell asleep, thinking not only of Ethan, but also of the possibility that their family of 2 was about to become a family of 3. May arrived with a fine and persistent rain that turned New York into a canvas of ash and reflections. David watched from the window of his office as the drops trickled down the glass, creating hypnotic patterns that made him think about how much his life had changed in recent weeks. Sarah had become a constant presence. Wednesday dinners, Saturday park outings, and sporadic text messages during the week, asking about Ethan or sharing little moments of the day. The phone rang, pulling him from his daydreams. It was Marcia, his secretary, with an unusually hesitant tone in her voice. "David, there's a woman here who wants to speak with you. She says it's about Ethan, but she didn't give more details. Her name is Anna Parker." David furrowed his brow. The name was unfamiliar to him, and few people knew about Ethan in a professional context. "Does she have an appointment?" "No, but she insists it's urgent. She seems very nervous." Something in Marcia's tone made David hesitate. "Can you ask her to wait 5 minutes? And Marcia, stay close, okay?" When Anna Parker entered his office, David immediately noticed she was very young. She couldn't be more than 23. Tall and slender, with brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail, she wore modest but clean clothes, a white cotton blouse and a knee-length denim skirt. She carried a colorful fabric bag, and there was something in her eyes, a mix of determination and absolute terror, that made David's stomach tighten. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for seeing me." Her voice was soft, but trembled slightly. "I know I don't have an appointment, but it's about my son." David felt the world stop spinning. "Your son?" Anna took a deep breath, as if gathering courage to jump off a cliff. Ethan is my son." The silence that followed was deafening. David could hear his own heart beating, the hum of the air conditioning, the distant traffic on Fifth Avenue. But the young woman's words echoed in his mind like alarm bells. "That's not possible," he finally said, his voice sounding strangely distant to his own ears. "The adoption papers, the biological mother renounced all rights." "I didn't renounce anything." Anna opened her bag with trembling hands and pulled out a yellowed folder. "I was 17. My family forced me to give Ethan up. They said if I didn't do it, they would kick me out of the house and could never help me again." Tears began to form in her eyes. "I never wanted to give him up. I never stopped looking for him." David took the document she extended, his hands trembling imperceptibly. There was an original birth certificate, Ethan Parker, born on March 15, 2018. Mother Anna Parker, 17 years old student. There were also photographs, a young pregnant woman shyly smiling at the camera, the same young woman holding a newborn baby in the hospital, pages and pages of a handwritten diary. "How did you find me?" David managed to ask. "I spent 3 years searching. I hired a private investigator last year. I used all my savings from working as a teacher." Anna wiped her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "He discovered that Ethan was adopted by you through St. Mary's Orphanage. It took a few more months to get your name and address." David opened the diary to a random page and read, "Today Ethan turned 3 months old. Is he already smiling? Does the family that adopted him read him bedtime stories? I hope he knows, somehow, that his real mother loves him more than anything in the world, and has never stopped thinking about him for a single day." The reality began to settle in like ice water in the veins. David stood up abruptly, walking to the window without really seeing the urban landscape outside. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. "I want to meet my son." Anna had also stood up, and David could see her reflection in the glass of the window. A brave young woman facing a man clearly more powerful and influential than she was. "I didn't come here to take him away from you. I know you can give him things I never could. But he is my child, Mr. Johnson. I carried him for 9 months. I loved him from the first moment, and I have the right to be part of his life." David turned, staring directly at her. "And what if I say no? What if I protect Ethan from this disruption in his life?" Anna lifted her chin, a spark of determination shining in her tear-filled eyes. "Then I will go to court. I have proof that the adoption was not voluntary. I can prove familial coercion and lack of proper legal assistance during the process." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But I would prefer we do this amicably. Ethan is a child, not an object. He deserves to know his true story." The mention of court made David retreat to his chair, his businessman mind immediately calculating risks and probabilities. If Anna had truly been coerced at 17, if there were irregularities in the adoption process, You want custody back? "No," the answer was immediate and firm. "I know it would be selfish of me to take Ethan from an established life, but I want to be part of his life. I want him to know who I am, to understand that he was loved from the very first moment, that his adoption was not abandonment." David closed his eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. In 20 minutes, his life had been turned upside down. Ethan was no longer just his son. There was another person in the world with a legitimate, emotional, and possibly legal claim to the child he loved more than anything. How be sure you are really his mother?" David asked, trying to buy time to think. Anna smiled sadly. "Ethan has a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on his right wrist. As a baby, he could only fall asleep if someone sang 'Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star.' It was the only song that calmed him in the hospital. And," she hesitated, "he probably still has occasional nightmares about a dark house. They were flashbacks from his early days in the orphanage when he cried inconsolably." David's stomach dropped. All those details were true. Ethan still occasionally woke up from nightmares about dark places, and the crescent moon mark on his wrist was something David had noticed from day one, but never questioned. "I need time," David finally said, "to process this, to think about what is best for Ethan." "Of course, I completely understand." Anna took a simple card from her bag. "This is my number. I work at Little Scholars Academy in the South Bronx. It's a public school teaching 4- and 5-year-olds. She smiled with genuine pride. "I chose to work with children Ethan's age. It was the closest way I could be to him, even not knowing where he was." After Anna left, David sat alone in his office for over an hour, staring at the documents she had left. Photographs of a pregnant teenager who clearly loved the baby she carried. Diary pages filled with love and longing, proof that she had never stopped searching for Ethan. His rational mind knew he needed legal verification, DNA, consultation with lawyers, but his heart already knew the truth. That young woman was indeed Ethan's biological mother, and her story of familial coercion was likely true. The worst part was that David couldn't even be angry with her. Anna was not an opportunist or a malicious threat. She was simply a mother who loved her child and had been forced by circumstances into a separation she never wanted. When he finally got home that night, Ethan ran to hug him as he always did, chattering about his day at school and asking if Sarah would come for dinner that week. David hugged him tighter than usual, breathing in that characteristic scent of children's shampoo and outdoor adventures, trying to memorize every detail of that moment before everything changed forever. "Dad, are you okay?" Ethan asked, tilting his Ed with that sharp perception that children sometimes show. "I'm fine, my love," David lied, kissing the top of his curly head, "just tired from work." But that night, after Ethan fell asleep, David sat in the dark of the living room with his phone in hand, looking at Sarah's number. He needed to tell her about Anna. He needed someone who understood Ethan as much as he did to help him navigate this impossible situation. But when he dialed the number, his hands were trembling, because he knew that telling Sarah about Ethan's biological mother would mean admitting that the small, perfect family they were building together was about to get complicated in unimaginable ways. "David?" Sarah's voice sounded concerned through the line. "Is everything okay? It's late for you to call." "Sarah," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I need to talk to you. It's about Ethan and about us." The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a few seconds, but for David, it felt like an eternity. He could imagine Sarah sitting in her small kitchen, perhaps making the chamomile tea she always had before bed, processing the urgency in his voice. "I'll be right over," she said simply. "Sarah, it's late. You have a shift early tomorrow." "David," her voice carried a firmness he rarely heard. "If it's about Ethan, I'm coming. Period." 20 minutes later, Sarah was sitting on the sofa in the living room, where just 2 weeks earlier the three of them had painted with their hands and laughed like a real family. Now, under the soft glow of the lamp, she watched David pace back and forth, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Ethan's biological mother showed up at my office today," he finally said, stopping, to face Sarah directly. Sarah froze for a moment, as if time had stopped. Then slowly she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Tell me everything," she said, with a calmness that contrasted with the panic David felt rising in his chest. For the next 40 minutes, David recounted every detail of the meeting with Anna Parker. The documents, the photographs, the diary, the allegations of family coercion. Sarah listened with the full attention of a nurse receiving critical information about a patient, asking pointed questions, but allowing him to tell the story at his own pace. When he finished, Sarah remained silent for a long moment, clearly processing all the implications. "Do you believe her?" she finally asked. David sighed deeply. "Unfortunately, yes. The details she knew about Ethan, the photographs, everything feels genuine. And there's something in her eyes, Sarah. The pain is real. The love is real." Sarah nodded slowly. "And what does she want exactly?" "She says she wants to be part of his life. She doesn't want to take Ethan away from me, but she wants him to know her, to understand his true story." David sat heavily beside her on the sofa. "Sarah, I don't know what to do. For 3 years, I've built my entire identity around being Ethan's father, and now you are still his father," Sarah gently interrupted, placing her hand over his. "David, look at me." When he complied, she continued, "Ethan loves you. You are the only father he knows, the man who raised him, who cared for him when he was sick, who taught him how to be a good person. DNA doesn't change that. But what if she wants more? What if she decides to fight for custody? What if Ethan, upon meeting her, decides he wants to live with his real mother?" David's insecurities spilled out like a broken dam. Sarah turned fully to face him. "David, can I tell you something you might not know about Ethan?" He nodded, bracing himself for yet another revelation that could further shake his world. "When Ethan came to the orphanage, I was there. He was only 2 weeks old, just like Anna said. But he didn't come alone. He came with a letter." Sarah paused, taking a deep breath. The letter was from his biological mother. She specifically asked that when Ethan was adopted, the adoptive parents should know that she loved him more than anything, that the surrender was not her choice, and that her greatest wish was for him to understand this one day. David felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Why didn't anyone tell me about this letter? Because the orphanage's policy at the time was to facilitate a clean break between children and biological parents. The letter was filed away, and theoretically, it would only be given if Ethan, as an adult, sought information about his origins. Sarah looked down. I always disagreed with that policy. I always believed Ethan had the right to know his complete story. David fell silent, processing this new information. A part of him felt betrayed, for not having received complete information, for having based his decisions about Ethan's life on incomplete data. But another part, the part that had learned to love unconditionally over the past 3 years, began to understand that perhaps there was a way to navigate this situation without anyone losing everything. Sarah, he said slowly, do you think I should let Ethan meet Anna Parker? Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. David, I'm going to be completely honest with you, even if it's not what you want to hear. She turned to face him. Ethan has the right to know his biological mother. He has the right to understand his story. And Anna has the right to know the son she was forced to give up. But what about us? David asked, realizing that the us included not only him and Ethan, but also Sarah. What about the family we are building? Sarah returned to the sofa, sitting closer to him this time. David, family is not a limited resource. Love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies. Ethan can love you as a father, love Anna as his biological mother, and... She paused, blushing slightly. And love me as the person who cared for him when he was a baby and who wants to continue being part of his life. You're not going to leave. The question came out more vulnerably than David intended. Why would I leave? Because now everything has gotten complicated. Because instead of a simple family, we'll have to navigate relationships with multiple people, share time, deal with legal issues. Sarah took his face in her hands, forcing him to look directly into her eyes. David Johnson, do you really think I would spend 3 years finding a way back into Ethan's life just to run away when things got complicated? The intensity in her voice surprised him. No, Ethan is special to me in a way that goes beyond any complication. And you... She hesitated for a moment before continuing. You have become very important to me too. I won't abandon you when you need support the most. David felt something release in his chest, a knot of tension he had been holding for weeks. So you think we should meet Anna Parker as a family? I think we should meet her as people who love Ethan and want what's best for him, Sarah corrected. Thank you. After this, we will see how to proceed. The next morning, David called Anna before even having coffee. His night had been filled with fragmented dreams where Ethan was running between him, Sarah, and an unknown young woman, shouting, "Mommy!" to all of them. He woke up knowing that the only way to protect Ethan was to face the situation head-on with honesty and courage. Anna, it's David Johnson. Mr. Johnson. Her voice showed a mix of hope and nervousness. Have you thought about our conversation? I have, and I would like to propose something. David took a deep breath. How about we meet to talk? You, me, and someone very important in Ethan's life, a nurse named Sarah who took care of him when he was a baby. There was a pause on the other end of the line. You're not angry with me? The question caught David by surprise. Anna, you are Ethan's biological mother. You loved him when you were forced to give him up, and clearly you have never stopped loving him. How could I be angry with you for that? She began to cry on the other end of the line. a cry of relief that David could feel through the phone connection. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding. Let's meet tomorrow afternoon. There's a lot we need to discuss before we think about introducing you to Ethan." When he hung up, David sat at the kitchen table where he had shared so many morning coffees with Ethan, and realized that for the first time since Anna had come into his life, he was not feeling panic. Instead, there was a strange sensation that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to give Ethan what every child deserved, a family that loved him unconditionally, even if that family didn't look like anything he had imagined before. The afternoon coffee was set for 3 o'clock on Saturday at a discreet cafe in the Upper East Side, far from both David's professional routine and the places where Ethan used to play. David arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a table in the back where they could talk privately. Sarah showed up promptly at 3, wearing a simple yet elegant outfit, a navy blue midi skirt and a white blouse that made her look older, more official, as if she were preparing for an important work meeting. "How are you feeling?" she asked, sitting next to him instead of across from him, a subtle gesture that showed they were united in this situation. "Nervous," David admitted, absently stirring the coffee he had ordered but not touched. "I keep wondering if I'm doing the right thing, if I should have sought a lawyer first, protected my legal rights." "David," Sarah placed her hand over his, "Ethan is not property to be defended. He is a child who deserves all the people who love him working together for his well-being." Anna arrived exactly at 3:15, looking hesitantly around the cafe until she spotted David. She wore a simple floral print dress and carried a small brown leather bag, clearly her best clothes, carefully chosen to make a good impression. There was something touching about the effort she had made to appear respectable, professional, worthy of being Ethan's mother. "Anna," David stood to greet her. "This is Sarah Johnson, the nurse who took care of Ethan when he was a baby." The two women studied each other for a moment. Sarah with her confident posture of an experienced healthcare professional, Anna with the nervous determination of a young woman fighting for the right to know her own son. Then Sarah extended her hand with a genuine smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Anna. Ethan is a very special child." "Thank you for taking care of him," Anna replied, shaking Sarah's hand firmly. "I know it was you who kept him safe when I couldn't." David watched the interaction between the two women with a mix of admiration and relief. There was something profoundly civilized about the way they were handling a situation that could easily have turned into a territorial battle. "Anna," David began after everyone was seated, "before we talk about Ethan, I need to understand your situation better. You mentioned that you were forced to give up the baby. Can you tell us more details?" Anna took a deep breath, clearly preparing to relive painful memories. "My family is traditional. My father works at an accounting firm in the Upper East Side. My mother never worked outside the home. When they found out I was pregnant at 16, it was as if the world had ended." She paused to take a sip of water, her hands trembling slightly. "Ethan's father was a classmate. When I told him about the pregnancy, he just disappeared, changed schools, his family moved. I never heard from him again." Sarah leaned forward, her expression showing the professional empathy she developed with young patients in similar situations. "And your family? How did they react?" "My father said I had ruined the family name. My mother cried every day, saying she wouldn't know how to explain it to the neighbors, to the extended family." Anna discreetly wiped away a tear that was beginning to form. "They gave me 2 options, have an abortion or give the baby up for adoption as soon as he was born." David felt his stomach tighten. "And you? What did you want to do?" "I wanted my baby," Anna said, with a firmness that contrasted with her tears. From the moment I found out I was pregnant, I loved that child. I spent nights awake talking to him, singing, making plans. Even being very young, I knew I wanted to be his mother. But you ended up giving him up, Sarah gently observed, with no judgment in her voice. Because my parents told me that if I didn't do it, they would kick me out of the house without a penny, that they would never speak to me again, that I would completely lose their support. Family. Anna paused, wiping her eyes with a napkin. I was 17, Mr. Johnson. I had no job. I hadn't finished high school, and I had nowhere to go. I thought it might be better for Ethan to have a family that could take care of him properly. David and Sarah exchanged glances. Anna's story was exactly what they had feared. A young woman coerced by family and social pressures, not a mother who genuinely didn't want her child. And then, David asked, what happened after the birth? I spent 2 days with Ethan in the hospital. They were the happiest and saddest days of my life. Anna smiled through her tears. He was perfect, small but perfect. I sang to him, held his tiny hand, memorized every detail of his face. Sarah leaned forward. Anna, do you remember any specific nurse during those 2 days? Anna looked at Sarah more attentively. There was a very young nurse, dark hair, who stayed with me during the nights when I cried. She told me that Ethan would be loved, that I was doing the right thing. She sang to him when I couldn't stop crying to do it. Anna paused, studying Sarah's face. It was you, wasn't it? Sarah nodded. It was me. I was an intern at the time, working the night shifts. I remember you, Anna. I remember how much you loved Ethan, how hard it was for you to let him go. The two women looked at each other for a moment, filled with emotion, a connection that had been interrupted 5 years ago finally being reconnected. After I left the hospital, Anna continued, I went back to my parents' house, but I couldn't stay. I finished high school through a GED program, got a scholarship to study education, and by 18 I moved out. I haven't spoken to my parents since. David absorbed this information. And since then, I've been working as a teacher for 3 years. I live in a small apartment in South Bronx, sharing it with a roommate. It's not much, but it's honest. And every day since Ethan was born, I thought about him. I wondered if he was okay, if he was happy, if he would ever know that his mother loved him. The sincerity in Anna's voice was undeniable. David could see why she had faced so many difficulties to find Ethan. It wasn't whim or opportunism, but genuine maternal love that had been forced to stay submerged for years. Anna, Sarah said gently, what do you hope for? Now, what's your plan? Honestly, I don't have a specific plan. Anna looked between David and Sarah. I know Ethan has a good life with you. I know you can give him things I can't. I don't want to destroy that, but... She paused, searching for the right words. I want him to know that he has a mother who never stopped loving him. I want to be part of his life, even if it's a small part. David was silent for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. Anna was not the threat he had feared. She was simply a mother who wanted to reconnect with her son, but there were still enormous practical questions to consider. Anna, I need to be direct about a few things, he finally said. First, I will need legal confirmation that you are indeed Ethan's mother. DNA test, verification of the documents you brought. Not that I doubt your story, but I need to protect Ethan from any uncertainty. Anna nodded immediately. Of course, I completely understand. Second, if we're going to do this, it needs to be in a way that protects Ethan emotionally. He's a 5-year-old child who believes his mother is traveling very far away. Introducing you suddenly as his real mother could be confusing and traumatic. I totally agree. What do you suggest? David looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. I suggest we start slow. Maybe you can initially be introduced as a friend of ours. Let Ethan get used to you, create a natural bond. Then, when the time is right, we can gradually introduce the truth about who you are." "And how long would that take?" Anna asked. "I don't know," David admitted. "Weeks, maybe months. It depends on how Ethan reacts, how you adapt to the dynamics of our family." "Our family?" Anna repeated, and David realized he had automatically included Sarah in that description. Sarah smiled. "It's complicated," she said, "but basically David is Ethan's adoptive father. I am a supportive maternal figure, and you would be the biological mother who wants to be part of his life." Anna processed this for a moment. "That's not a traditional family." "No," David agreed, "but perhaps Ethan would benefit from having multiple people who love him, each contributing something different to his life." Anna smiled, the first genuine smile David had seen since he met her. "I would love that. I would love to be part of a non-traditional family that loves Ethan." Sarah raised her coffee cup. "So are we doing this? Are we going to try to create an extended family for Ethan?" David raised his cup too, followed by Anna. "To the next steps," he said, "and to figuring out how to make this work." As they said goodbye outside the cafe, David watched Anna walk toward the bus stop and felt a strange mix of apprehension and hope. His life was about to get infinitely more complicated. But when he looked at Sarah, who was beside him watching the same scene, he realized that perhaps the complication would be worth it if it meant Ethan would grow up knowing he was loved by more people than many children could dream of. "So," Sarah said, intertwining her arm with his as they walked back to the car, "when are we going to tell Ethan that he's about to gain another special person in his life?" "I don't know yet," David replied. "But I know that I want to do this right. Ethan deserves to know. His entire history, all the people who love him, even if it means that our little family of two becomes, well, whatever that will become."